Do you recognize or believe that you truly need God's mercy? Do you recognize or believe that you truly need God's compassion? And do you recognize and believe you truly need God's forgiveness? How we answer these questions is fundamental really to our relationship with God and our relationship with others. Because ultimately we are told in the first letter of John, if someone says that they're not a sinner, then they make God a liar. Because ultimately he sent Christ for all people. Actually need Jesus in our life. Because that is why he came. But ultimately, the point that Jesus makes today comes right out of our own understanding of our need for God's mercy, his compassion, his forgiveness. Because in order to receive that from God, we must become a conduit of it, of his mercy, his compassion, and his forgiveness. And we cannot become a dam. We can't hold it back just for ourselves. As God pours forth his grace, his mercy, his forgiveness, his compassion into our lives, he's intending for us to channel it into the lives of others. We become not simply the recipient of it, but we become how others receive it. And ultimately, we cannot receive what we are not willing to give to others. Forgiveness, then, is not an option in Christian life. You don't get to pick and choose who you're going to forgive. You don't get to pick and choose whether forgiveness is even something you will consider. Christ came to save us and set us free. He died for the forgiveness of sin. And we can never forget that truth and reality. And so the question is, are we willing to be that conduit? Are we willing to be that channel? And I will admit, this is probably one of the most difficult things that Jesus really does ask for us to do. When we get hurt, when someone has truly damaged us in our lives, when they may have done horrific things, it can be hard to conceive of the idea that I could ever bear forgiveness towards that person. But the ultimate truth is, when we choose not to forgive, we're not harming the other person. How does our lack of forgiveness bother them? It generally doesn't. The only one we harm when we choose not to forgive is ourselves. Because we're blocking ourselves from God's compassion, mercy, and forgiveness. But as I said, forgiveness is not always easy. Sure, in some of the small things that can happen in our lives, we can easily let it go. But again, in those big things, it can be hard. And that's why I tell people forgiveness is essentially a process. And it begins, I believe, with a particular prayer. Because ultimately, our ability to forgive doesn't come from us. It comes from God. It's his grace that gives us the ability to be able to begin the healing process within ourselves. And so what is this simple prayer? Lord, help me to want to forgive. Because sometimes that really is the first step. We have no desire to forgive at all. We know we should. Jesus makes that clear today and over. This is not a one-time message from Christ. We know we should forgive, but I feel so wounded and hurt that I simply cannot feel that right now. And trust me, God gets that. And that's why we have that simple prayer. Lord, help me to want to forgive. And I think we have to actually pray that prayer every day. Sometimes maybe even multiple times during the day to keep our hearts open to God's grace, to his mercy. And we may have to pray that prayer, honestly, for years before it takes root. But you're still on the path of forgiveness. And that's how I think Jesus asks of us. But once it does take root, and trust me, it will. If you keep praying it every day, at some point, your heart will open. God's grace will work its way in. So I always say, God's grace is kind of like the way water works. It finds the easiest channel to sort of start working through and breaking things down. And the fact that you are opening your heart to that grace will allow it to happen. When we finally get there and we have the desire to forgive the person, then we pray for the grace to forgive them. Because again, it's not something we do on our own. Jesus is not asking us to do this on our own. He wants to help us and to work with us. And ultimately, we work with God to change our heart towards the person. Now, it's really important as we talk about forgiveness, because I think people have the wrong idea about it in many ways. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. If you've been wounded, the wound is going to be with you, even after you've forgiven the person. You're not going to forget what has happened to you. Forgiveness then is not about forgetting. So that old line you hear, forgive and forget that. And it's also not about wanting the proper consequences to happen to the person. If someone has done something wrong, there are consequences to that. And those consequences should be met. But ultimately, what is forgiveness? Is about coming to the desire of what is best for the person we need to forgive. That the best happens for them. That doesn't mean you have to ever want them back in your life, particularly if you've been in an abusive relationship. But your heart will be coming to truly love that person unconditionally. And desire, as they begin to live out their life, that they come to experience what you are experiencing now by forgiving them. That they will come to truly experience in their own life God's mercy, compassion, and forgiveness. That's the ultimate goal of forgiveness, is that we can come to achieve that. And therefore, as we act, as we pray through this, and as we allow God's grace and mercy to change our hearts and our lives, as we act as that channel of God's grace, mercy and compassion and forgiveness, we then truly become the presence of Christ in the world. And that should be our ultimate goal. Because Jesus has come to forgive us. And that's his ultimate job. And if we are to truly be his presence to others, then it is through that forgiveness that it will happen. And it is there that we come to live for the Lord.